This is Hanan Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Belagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory, From Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 11, From Structuralism to Poststructuralism, Text, Power, Minor Literature, Deconstruction. Ronald Barthes' Mythologies is a foundational structural text that critiques how bourgeois ideology disguises itself as natural and eternal. Drawing on Saussure's semiotics and influenced by Sartre and Nietzsche, Barthes dismantles myths perpetuated by media, consumer culture, and colonial representations. He shows how seemingly neutral signs, like a black boy saluting the French flag, carry a second-order ideological message that glorifies colonialism and loyalty to empire. Barthes terms this second-order meaning connotation, a distortion that masks historical contingency as timeless truth. Myth, in this sense, fabricates a pseudo-nature that obscures political conflict, social inequality, and historical violence. Examples such as French wine in Algeria or Franco's sanitized image of Spain illustrate how dominant culture uses signs to enforce ideological dominance and suppress resistance. Barthes criticizes essentialism, affirming instead the constructedness of race, class, and national identity as ideological products. The methodologist, according to Barthes, is the critic who reveals these false naturalizations and restores historical specificity through critical reading. While Barthes initially maintains stark binaries between myth and truth, oppressor and oppressed, this position gradually reveals deep internal contradictions and interpretive tensions. His practice of ideological demystification begins to resemble the very totalizing myths it opposes, claiming to expose truth while concealing its own interpretive construction beneath rhetorical authority. Like the bourgeoisie he critiques, the mythologist also risks asserting mastery, pretending to speak from a position of unmediated and objective historical truth. By the early 1960s, Barthes' writing increasingly reflects skepticism about the very clarity, stability, and coherence of meaning his earlier work assumes. He begins to question whether science can be decoded with certainty or whether reality can ever be rendered perfectly intelligible at all. Influenced by thinkers like Kristeva and Barthes, he begins to view texts not as concealed meanings to be uncovered, but as plural surfaces to be actively played with and interpreted anew. His emerging theory of the text pivots away from fixed ideological content toward undecidability, polysemy, and irreducible interpretive multiplicity. In The Death of the Author, Barthes declares that meaning is not created by the author, but emerges through the act of reading. The text becomes a field of intersecting voices with no origin, no center, and no final interpretation to uncover. Unlike the work, which invites authoritative reading, the text resists closure and defers meaning endlessly in a productive ambiguity. Barthes calls for readings that abandon mastery and instead participate in the ongoing production of meaning, collaborative, partial, and provisional. In SZ, he dismantles Balzac's Saracen into lexious and interpretive codes, insisting that his reading is not final, but deliberately disruptive and playful. The 5 narrative codes he identifies, hermeneutic, semantic, prioritic, cultural, and symbolic, do not uncover a single meaning, but expose overlapping narrative threads. Barthes redefines criticism as an act of textual weaving or engagement, rather than one of excavation or deciphering. This shift reflects his political alignment with the micropolitics of the May 68 and a desire to dissolve the authoritarian reader in favor of textual openness. In this later view, the text is a network without judges, stable centers, or final interpretive truths. Pierre Macherey's A Theory of Literary Production marks a significant move from structuralism to poststructuralism and a deep rethinking of Marxist criticism. He rejects the idea that literature expresses a unified meaning or ideology. Instead, it is riddled with gaps, contradictions, and unsettling silences. For Macherey, meaning arises not from what a text overtly says, but from what it cannot say, from ruptures that interrupt its apparent coherence. He views literature as an assemblage of already existing discourses, heterogeneous, borrowed, ideologically loaded, and historically determined. Rather than uncovering hidden truths, critics should examine how texts are constructed, what materials they use, how these materials collide and what they generate. He refutes both empirical realism and classical Marxism, rejecting literature as either a mirror of reality or a seamless ideological reflection. Literature, in Macherey's view, emerges from multiple historical conditions but never represents them directly or without internal conflict. Its tensions, silences, and absences testify to the disjointed nature of history and to literature's potential as a transformative critical practice. Michel Foucault's What is an Author extends Barthes' critique of authorship by locating the author within historically specific discursive formations. He introduces the concept of the author function, a regulatory construct that organizes, restricts, and disciplines how texts are read and grouped. The author in this framework is not a person, but a classificatory function that determines coherence, attribution, and interpretive boundaries. Foucault shows how this function emerged in the 17th century when literature began requiring authorship while scientific discourse no longer did. Authorship became a condition for legal responsibility and intellectual property, linking the author to both valorization and punishment. This transformation reflects the broader working of modern power, which individualizes subjects by anchoring discourse to identity and control. The author, like the delinquent or the pervert, is a product of institutional needs and epistemological systems designed to manage meaning. Literary criticism, therefore, is not innocent. It participates in constructing the very figure it claims to analyze or liberate. In Nietzsche genealogy history, Foucault rejects traditional history's pursuit of origins, continuity, and teleology in favor of discontinuity, accident, and rupture. Genealogy traces how truths, norms, and identities emerge from struggles between competing forces rather than from rational progression. He insists that power and knowledge are inseparable. Knowledge does not reflect reality, but actively produces it within institutional frameworks. In Discipline and Punished, Foucault illustrates how modern disciplinary power creates docile and productive bodies through surveillance and normalization. The Panopticon exemplifies this internalized control, where the watch subject polices themselves without external coercion. Power is not merely repressive, but constitutive. It shapes subjects by fabricating identities and structuring possibilities of thought and behavior. Resistance for Foucault must also be reimagined. It is no longer revolution from above, but subversion from below, through localized, lateral, tactical intervention. Literature, like the prison or school, participate in this power knowledge nexus, and thus becomes a crucial site of analysis and resistance. In the history of sexuality, Foucault challenges the repressive hypothesis, arguing that modern societies have in fact multiplied discourses on sex. These discourses, medical, legal, psychiatric, do not merely describe sexuality, but actually produce it, fabricating identities like the pervert. Surveillance, confession, and classification become tools of power, embedding sexuality deep within institutional frameworks. Yet Foucault emphasizes that such imposed identities can become sites of collective resistance, reinvention, and political solidarity. In the use of pleasure, he turns from institutional analysis to ancient Greek practices of self-stylization and ethical self-care. He explores how elite Greek males exercise freedom through temperance, bodily discipline, and reflective judgment, forms of aesthetics of existence. Here, power operates not as domination, but as a relational field where freedom is expressed through practices of self-formation. The subject, in this view, is neither fixed nor natural, but formed through ongoing negotiations between desire, norm, and self-mastery. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari radically reconceive literature not as representation, but as production of affects, flows, and newly formed social assemblages. In Kafka, Towards a Minor Literature, they define minor literature as political and collective, composed in a major language but always working to destabilize its norms. Minor literature deterritorializes language, making it stammer, shift, and open towards unfamiliar expressive and political possibilities. Language becomes performative rather than referential. It operates not to reflect meaning, but to trigger transformation and relational movement. Desire, in their view, is not a lack to be filled, but a reproductive force that animates connections between bodies, institutions, signs, and words. Assemblages, compositions of discursive and non-discursive elements, replace subjects as the central unit of social and literary analysis. Literature, accordingly, is not a mirror of the world, but an active intervention that generates new configurations of relations and affect. Their theory resists both psychoanalytic and Marxist reductionism, emphasizing instead multiplicity, variation, and ongoing emergence. Deleuze and Guattari replace the traditional idea of the literary subject with that of the assemblage, a shifting composition of forces with no stable core. In Anti-Oedipus, they critique Freud for reducing desire to familiar structures and Marxism for opposing false ideology to scientific truth. Desire is not personal or private. It is collective, impersonal, and embedded in political arrangements and mechanic social systems. Literature functions in a comparable way. It does not represent lived experience, but composes it through disjunctive connections and generative disruptions. Their pragmatics of literature asks not what texts mean, but how they work, how they operate within and intervene in the social field. Interpretation is displaced by experimentation, where literature serves as a site for tracing new potentials and assembling alternative forms of life. The critic becomes a map maker rather than a decipherer, identifying lines of light that evade capture by dominant codes. This aesthetic model is also an ethical one. For Deleuze and Guattari, good literature is that which fosters becoming, variation, and openness to difference. Jacques Derrida's deconstruction dismantles binary oppositions like presence-absence or speech-writing, which have undergirdled the metaphysical tradition since the time of Plato. Literature, in Derrida's account, becomes a privileged space for exposing the inherent instability of these oppositions and the undecidability of meaning itself. He refuses to define literature by any fixed essence or stable genre, instead treating it as an act that differs meaning and continually resists closure. Terms like difference, supplement, and trace demonstrate that signs never fully signify and meanings are always deferred, split, or incomplete. Deconstruction is not a formal method, but an interpretive event, a close reading that reveals internal contradictions in both texts and institutional cultures. The critic's task, then, is to respond ethically to textual singularity, offering counter-signature that both confirms and subtly transforms the original. Literature for Derrida is both inside and outside the institution. It is bound by conventions, yet allowed to suspend and creatively play with them. This double status enables it to critique institutional authority from within, disrupting philosophical hierarchies without claiming transcendence, detachment, or escape. Derrida's notion of iterability captures literature's paradox. It is both repeatable and always altered in each new context of reception. A literary text, therefore, is never fixed or final. It exceeds its own conditions and reappears differently with every act of reading and interpretation. This makes literature not merely aesthetic, but inherently political, because it opens meaning to contingency, difference, deferral, and reinvention. Derrida calls literature a strange institution, whose only law is the ability to break existing laws and question authority from within. It resists totalization, not by stepping outside the system, but by revealing through its structure and form the contradictions embedded within it. Even texts that appear phallocentric, conservative, or complicit may enact deconstructive effects in their rhetorical strategies, imagery, or syntax. Reading thus becomes an ethical practice, not decoding a message, but listening to the text's singularity while responding with one's own countersignature. For Derrida, literature enacts a radically democratic potential, offering a space where the future, the democracy to come, remains open, indeterminate, and shared. Poststructuralism redefines literature and criticism as fields of production, not reflection, emphasizing rupture, multiplicity, and contingency. Figures like Barthes, Macherey, Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida replace meaning with process, authorship with assemblage, and unity with difference. Literature becomes a site where institutional power is both exercised and resisted, where identity is disassembled and new modes of becoming are imagined. Across these theories, the critic is no longer a master of meaning, but a participant in an ongoing transformation of text, power, and possibility. Thank you for your attention.